Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. We're so glad that you have joined us for another episode of You Are From God. I'm here with Scott, and today, listener, we want to talk for a little bit about the subject of good and evil. If you've noticed the last few episodes, we've been going through some of these pieces of what we would call apologetics, not the idea of saying sorry. That's not the point of that word apologetics. Really, the source of apologetics is about giving a defense, having a reasoning and a logical understanding of the things that we profess in our faith. And we started 2 episodes ago looking at the idea of having questions and doubts, and that's completely normal in the life of faith. And the idea is what we do with those questions and doubts. Are we willing to seek the answers? Are we willing to change when we find the answers that this infallible book that God has preserved for us actually shows us the answers? And then the last episode, we talked a little bit, Scott, about this idea of reaching the lost, of how we deal with what God has called sin, and how we deal with it in our own lives, certainly, but also in particular how we reach out and talk to those around us. While we're not of the world, other people around us are lost in the world, and just some of the attitudes that we have towards that. So we want to kind of be in that same conversation on today's episode, but it's almost a step back in some ways where we really want to just think about the idea of good and evil. And I think, Scott, this is an important conversation for anybody who's trying to explain their faith or how they see the world from the Bible's perspective, or really just how the world is, because when we talk about good and evil, it is forcing us and everyone at some point to understand, well, what I call good or not good, or that there's ethics, what we might call, behind something, ultimately points to me making choices that, again, depending on what my ethics are, will impact my life, and certainly from the Bible's perspective, into eternity.
It's the big danger. If we all get to decide what is evil, or all get to decide what is good, then there's no standard that anybody's going to follow. You can't show anybody else that they're wrong, and they can't say that you're wrong. And obviously that makes no sense. And the struggle, Tyler, so often is that we kind of forget the importance of morality. And if we're going to determine that the scriptures teach what morality is, which is something we'll be talking about, then we have to be willing to accept what it says on these subjects, and not just simply based on what I already think or what I'm bringing into the scriptures themselves, but just allowing the scriptures to teach us and to understand who the standard, who gets to make those choices, which is obviously God. I think of Deuteronomy, the 30th chapter, is one of those places that God says, look, I'm going to give you a choice. I'm going to determine what you can choose from, but I'm going to give you the choice of what you're going to say. He's the one that gets to choose and define what morality is. He says, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and adversity. And then I command you today to love the Lord your God with all your and to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not obey, but you are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you will surely perish. You shall not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. So again, God's given us choices. He's not stopping us from doing the things that we would like to do, but it is a danger when we start making it and trying to pretend like it's the command, it's the morality that he's trying to say, yes, this is fine for you to do. No, he's saying, look, you have a choice to make. You can choose life, and this is going to be a good thing if you do. Or you can choose death, and that's the choice that you can make. But understand that there's going to be consequences to those choices. So the piece, Tyler, that I think is so important for us is to understand that it's not about us picking and choosing what we view to be good and evil. It's just picking and choosing whether or not we want to follow what God has to say, or what is good and evil. And that's a struggle for a lot of us.
Well, especially when we may be in situations in life or raised a certain way where I do get to decide what I think is best. And there is very much a you do you and you live your life, and what's best for you isn't best for me, and that's okay. Look, at the end of the day, we are all held accountable. And this is one of the big explanations for why there is a creator, why there is a God. It's one of the biggest fingerprints that God has left on our existence, that we have an innate sense, regardless of where we are born in this world and what age or time period, that there's a sense of things that are just good and things that are not good. And that's what we mean about morality and ethics, that there's things that no matter who you are, it's funny that most people in the world have a sense of you can't just kill somebody for no reason.
Right.
Like it's odd. And that lying, that idea of stealing the truth from somebody else carries a significant weight to it, and that we would agree, well, we can talk about all the side things, and what if you're lying to say somebody? We're not even talking about that. From this fundamental standpoint of lying, it's something that we would agree with, like we don't want as part of our everyday normal experience, because we can't have trust that way, and we can't build relationships that way. So as soon as you start admitting, okay, there are these, what we might call non-negotiables of, okay, like we just understand that there are things that are just good and we enjoy it, things that are beautiful and things that are ugly or bad. We get into this place of morality. And one of the things that people often go to is this idea of suffering. Okay, well, why would God even allow evil things like people suffering for no reason to exist? Obviously, when you bring in the idea of suffering, Scott, it's very natural for the Bible student to think about Job. This Old Testament book, it's very long. A lot of it is Job after he suffered immensely at the hands not of God, but of God allowing Satan to impact his life. Job's having this conversation with three friends, and the majority of the book is them going back and forth, and the friends basically having a false idea of morality of, well, you must have done something wrong, and Job saying, well, show me what I did wrong. If I could just stand before God and ask him, what is it exactly I'm being punished for? And again, these guys just have a wrong perspective of the good and evil that God has defined. And so God's going to intervene, but there is this fourth character that comes in Job 32 that we don't often talk about. His name is Elihu. And here, at least, the Bible is narrating, so we have a sense of divine inspiration where if it's a character talking, we can kind of get lost of, well, God's saying this, but it's actually just recording what the character said. Elihu here is being, his attitude is described. So we've got the narrator of the scriptures, which is ultimately God. You got Job 32, verses 1 and 2. These three men that are Job's friends ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. That's a verse we don't normally hear about when we're having this conversation about Job. Then in verse 2, then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. How often, Scott, do humans get into that same perspective? I'm going to justify myself. Well, I think this action are good, or I think this lifestyle is right, or I think this, rather than actually listening to what God has to say. And so Elihu's going to speak up and point this out to Job, but ultimately it's God who's going to start speaking up in Job 38 through the end of the book. And God simply says, look, dress for action. I'm going to ask you some questions. You've been asking me what's been happening and why. God does not answer this. Job asks throughout the book, why me? And God answers, I am. That's in Job 38 through Job 42. He is just asking him questions. Who made the foundation? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where are you when the mountain goats give birth? I'm intimately aware of every single aspect of my creation. You don't think I know what's going on with you? I know you, and I know what's good and evil, and I'm taking care of you. God has been aware of his situation the whole time and had been holding Satan back, in fact, from inflicting more suffering and pain. In Job 40, the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and will not answer twice, but will proceed no further. He keeps going on. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Like, at the end of the day, we're talking about a God who created everything, and we want to tell him, you've got a bad idea of morality, God. We don't get to make that choice. And that's the point that's being brought up here. God is going to bless Job immensely by the time this is all over as Job repents and recognizes he's been speaking out of turn. But Scott, it's just so important for us as we have this conversation about good and evil that we don't just try to assume that because I think it or feel that it is good, that it is necessarily good. That I'm not trying to make myself out to be righteous, but that I'm actually humbly coming before God, putting my hand over my mouth, as Job would say, and actually listening to what he says is good and right and true, and going from there. Does that mean it's always an easy answer? No, there can be wrestling that comes from that. But it's ultimately the idea of we have to have a standard, something outside of myself to look to say, yes, this is good, yes, this is evil, and it does not change.
Yeah, it can't be that we're all deciding to call good good and evil evil just simply based on what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what we find in the world. That's ultimately what we see from a lot of people. And the struggle for us is sometimes how do we handle that? And I think the danger for God's people is that we can almost choose and pick and choose what we want to determine to be the worst kind of sin or the worst part of evil, rather than understanding that it's God that is choosing the good and evil. I always think of Proverbs, the 6th chapter, where he talks about there's 6 things that the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him. And he gives these lists. And Tyler, if you asked me what I thought would be on this list, you would think of certain sins, murder. There would be certain things that you're going to put on this list. And God certainly hates those. I'm not suggesting that he's happy with some other sins, but what he specifically mentions here, to the point that you had just made, is lying. Our tongue, our hearts, all these different things that he mentions here, which sometimes we are really good at saying, well, that's not that big of a deal. What's the big deal if we lie a little bit or those types of things? We can justify sin so quickly rather than saying, God, you've given me this choice. You're the one that determines whether or not I want to, or what the good and what the evil is, and I get to determine whether or not I want to follow it. And that's really what this all comes down to. There are things that we're tempted by that we try to pretend like I cannot help myself. But the reality is that's what self-control is, and that's learning how to handle those things. Is that easy? Absolutely not. But if we're striving to serve God and do things God's way, that's the choice that you have. You either learn self-control and learn how to do things the way that God, the Lord, wants us to do them, or we don't. Tyler, I think one of the things that we struggle with, especially in America, is that we don't understand truly what a king was. You think about Esther as the wife, and there was a danger of him going into her husband and him not allowing her in there and actually choosing to have her killed. Those types of things, that's not something we understand. We just vote people out. That's just kind of the way that we do things. And so that's understandable from our perspective. But when it says that God is the king, and he's the King of Kings, and he is the creator, and all these different wonderful titles that he has, well, we don't get to pick and choose which commands we like and don't like. It's up to him. He's the one that gets to choose that. We get to choose whether or not we want to be his child. And that ultimately, as 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, is what it comes down to. Is it a temporal view that we have, or is it an eternal view that we have? And so whether there you're talking about suffering and looking things from that perspective, or we're just talking about things that we're tempted by. Am I willing to be tempted by these things, learn self-control, learn how to go against those things that are tempting me through this life for a better life to come, or not? That's the choice that we have. And that's a very difficult choice, don't get me wrong. But when we understand who God is, it certainly makes that choice a lot easier.
Every single one of us has this choice that Deuteronomy 30 talked about. I've set before you today good and evil, blessing and adversity, life and death. It's laid out for us. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to seek and know who God is and what he said is which. But Matthew 25, to your point, is Jesus teaching, and this is where we'll close, the idea that this choice has eternal consequences, and it is purely based, Jesus says, on us choosing what is good or what is evil. This is the parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus will come at the end and he separates and he talks to each group. Verse 31 of Matthew 25, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on the right, but the goats on the left. Then the king, to your point of the idea of a king, the king will say to those on his right, the sheep, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. He goes on to explain it's how they acted, it's how they treated people like Jesus, it's how they lived for God. But it's fascinating that he says that this is prepared for you. This is what God wants for you. Then you get down to verse 41. He turns to the group on the left. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for, not you, the devil and his angels. So it's not prepared for you. You're actually prepared. God prepared this other wonderful eternal blessing to dwell with him. That's what you're prepared for, but we choose, when we choose to do things our own way, when we choose to go against God's standard of what is good and evil, and we choose the evil, we're choosing to go to this place prepared for the devil and his angels. And that's why this conversation is so important, that we understand morality, that we understand that God is the author of good and evil, and that we understand that we have a responsibility to live in a conduct with such way that we are striving to know that good and evil in a way that we can choose the good and stay away from the evil, so that we can be holy like our Father in heaven, all because of what Jesus has done for us, because we are from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.